Hi, this is Carl A. Opson at the University of Arizona, and I'm going to tell you a little story about the IDEA definition of emotional disturbance. Tell you a little story about where the five key characteristics of the federal definition come from, um, what they look like in the law, and some of the problems and criticisms that folks have seen in this definition over the years. So by the time we're done, I'm hoping that you'll be able to list those five key characteristics of the definition of emotional disturbance and some of those problems with the definition. So where are we going to start? We're going to start with Eli Bauer, a researcher at UC Berkeley. And in 1957, he received some money from the California legislature to conduct a study, and he was trying to figure out what kids with emotional disturbance looked like in schools. So he went to a school. He would have a teacher with a classroom of kids. In each of those classrooms was one child that had been identified with a mental health issue. And the teacher would fill out a survey on the behavioral characteristics of all the kids in her classroom, so that for that one school, what Eli Bauer ended up with was a set of surveys filled out by a teacher about her children, with one of those surveys being filled out on a child with a mental health issue. But he didn't have just one. He had surveys from lots of schools. So he ended up with this huge pile of data about what teachers thought about the kids in their classrooms who were not involved in mental health services and the kids who were involved in mental health services. So what did he find by looking at those surveys? He looked for the differences in the ways the teachers filled out the surveys about the kids. And what he found out was that when he asked these teachers to say what kinds of things differentiate these kids over a marked degree in a long period of time, that there were five things that differentiated the kids who had mental health problems in school from the kids who didn't have mental health problems in school. One was that the kids with mental health problems had difficulty learning that couldn't be explained by any other factors, intellectual, sensory, or health. That these kids evidenced a difficulty in building and maintaining satisfactory interpersonal relationships with their peers and teachers. That they showed inappropriate types of behavior under normal circumstances. A general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems, something also referred to as somatization. That doesn't mean every kid evidenced every one of these characteristics, but these are the characteristics that were uncovered and were general across that group of kids with mental health problems in schools. So let's move on to almost 20 years later, when the feds are finalizing the definition for emotional disturbance in IDEA. And you know what they did? They used Bauer's definition, but they added a few things to it. One is that they said that not only does a kid have to show these characteristics for a marked degree over a long duration of time, but that it has to adversely affect their educational performance. And as we've seen, that's common in every IDEA categorical definition of disability, that it has to affect their educational performance. The five characteristics are entirely the same, and we'll get to some interesting criticisms of how the Fed's additions to this interact with the five characteristics in a minute. Another thing the feds added, and that they add to most definitions, disability in federal education law, was an inclusion and exclusion clause. And in this case, they say that the term emotional disturbance includes schizophrenia, but it does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted. So, 20 years after Bauer did the work, they applied his definition to the federal law. Here's the most fun part of the story. So several years after the law is passed, Bauer writes this article for Psychology in the Schools. Good journal. In which he criticizes the use of his definition in the federal law. If you have an interest in emotional and behavioral disorders, it's absolutely worth a read. The piece is really interesting, well written. It's really worthwhile things to say that absolutely stand to the current day. So Bauer criticized this definition, and so have other people. And here are some of the things that people have criticized this definition for over the years. First of all, when the definition was originally designed, it was listed as seriously emotionally disturbed. In later reauthorizations of IDEA, they removed the word seriously. So now it is just emotionally disturbed. And Bauer and others argued, I think reasonably, that if it's serious enough to give a kid a label that says emotionally disturbed, doesn't that tell you it's serious? Do you have to say serious? So they removed the word seriously. When Bauer did his study, he was asking teachers to consider behaviors that children engaged in over a long period of time and to a marked degree. And that's great for a survey, but it's more difficult in practice when you're trying to determine how long does a child have to engage in a particular behavior in order for us to identify this child as actually having an emotional disturbance, and to what marked degree. And certainly a lot of effort has gone into tools to help us separate whether or not a child is engaging in an activity at a level that is clinically significant or critically significant. The criteria are very broad. The Bauer article is wonderful in describing how it's a much different task to determine whether a child has an emotional problem than it is to determine whether a child has a learning disability. And finally, the social maladjustment clause. I won't go into too great a depth. Kaufman and others have written brilliantly on this notion that social maladjustment is really not a well-described term, and most states don't enforce that element of the definition. Some states do, and it has been criticized for possibly being used to keep certain types of children out of the category of emotional disturbance. So now you know what the 5 key characteristics of the federal definition are, where they came from, Eli Bauer, in his 1957 research, how they were incorporated into the 1975 IDEA definition, and that wonderful article that Bauer wrote in 1982 that criticizes that definition, and what some other folks have criticized the definition for.